The steady beep of the cardiac monitor drummed against Dr. Amber Lynn's nerves as she hurried through the corridors of Nightingale General Hospital. She had been at the end of a brutally long shift when the call came in, an urgent request for the best intensivist on staff, something about a high-profile patient in critical condition. The fluorescent lights overhead gave off a harsh glare that made her already pounding headache throb, but Amber pushed through her fatigue. Years of experience had taught her that every moment counted in cases like these, and if a life was hanging in the balance, she wouldn't allow her own exhaustion to cost a patient their chance at survival. When Amber reached the ICU, she was greeted by a flurry of frantic medical staff. Shouts and clipped instructions filled the air. Through the clutter of bodies, she spotted the figure on the bed, a man lying frighteningly still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest under a tangle of tubes and wires. The overhead light revealed the pale, sweat-slicked face of John Gray, the reclusive CEO of Gray Tech Innovations, a name Amber recognized from countless headlines in her personal reading on cutting-edge technology. But now, in this moment, he was not a titan of industry. He was a vulnerable patient on the brink, and the lines of tension across his brow spoke of a different battle altogether. She rushed to the bedside, scanning the monitors while a breathless resident relayed the grim details. Severe cardiac complications following an undetected infection, culminating in respiratory failure that had nearly sealed his fate before he was even wheeled into the hospital. Her eyes flicked to the readouts: dangerously low blood pressure, erratic heart rhythm, oxygen levels dropping. It was a nightmare scenario that demanded immediate action. Amber snapped into command, instructing the team on medication doses, reviewing critical labs, and calibrating the ventilator settings to stabilize his precarious condition. All the while, adrenaline surged through her veins, transforming fatigue into razor-sharp focus. Between administering life-saving interventions, Amber stole a moment to really look at him, the man behind the headlines and rumors, now so fragile beneath the unflattering wash of hospital fluorescence. She'd heard whispers of John's relentless drive and rumored brilliance, how he rarely slept, how he seemed to thrive on risking everything for the sake of progress. She couldn't imagine such a formidable spirit succumbing to a single infection. Yet here he was, fighting for each breath, as machines kept him tethered to life. Her heart twisted with an unexpected ache. Beneath every mythologized figure was a person capable of hurting, bleeding, and if fate was unkind, dying alone in a sterile hospital room. The battle lasted hours, a grueling marathon of medical precision that tested Amber's stamina and resolve. When the crisis began to plateau, the staff gradually peeled away, leaving only Amber and a couple of exhausted nurses to monitor John's vitals. At that point, he was stable yet teetering on the edge. The beep of the monitor fell into a slow, rhythmic pattern that felt like a metronome ticking off precious seconds of hope and dread. The nurses eventually left to tend to other patients, and Amber found herself alone at his bedside, heart pounding with residual adrenaline. She couldn't shake the sense that he was lingering at a boundary between worlds, and if something didn't shift soon, he might slip away forever. That was when a strange impulse took hold. Perhaps it was the emotional fatigue of the day or the echo of her own memories, moments she'd lost, loved ones, without being able to say a proper goodbye. Her gaze fell on John's pale face, etched with lines of strain even in unconsciousness. In that moment, Amber believed with a solemn certainty that he might never open his eyes again. Her professional training admonished her to remain detached, yet her humanity rebelled against such clinical distance. Leaning in gently, she brushed a trembling hand across his clammy brow. Without fully understanding why, she pressed a soft, fleeting kiss to his damp forehead, a final gift of compassion to a man she assumed fate had already claimed. The instant her lips met his skin, a whisper of heat coursed through her, a spark of life that defied her expectations. It was over in a heartbeat, a stolen gesture of empathy. Her cheeks burned with both embarrassment and the sorrow of losing a patient who wasn't officially gone yet, but the sense that she had to do something, anything, lingered in her chest like a silent prayer. Little did she know that singular moment would set into motion a chain of events that would alter both their lives. Outside, the hospital's intercom crackled. Another emergency beckoned, and Amber pried herself away, never expecting that John Gray, a man she believed was beyond saving, would soon open his eyes and turn her world upside down. Amber had just pulled off her scrubs in the tiny on-call room, exhaustion tugging at her limbs, when she heard an urgent knock on the door. A nurse peered in, expression tense. "He's awake," she said simply, voice taut with both relief and apprehension. In that instant, all thoughts of rest vanished. Amber's heart hammered with a curious mix of anticipation and disbelief. John, the patient she'd nearly pronounced a lost cause, had not only survived the night, but had regained consciousness. She donned a clean lab coat and hurried back down the labyrinth of corridors to the ICU. The hush that usually enveloped the ward was tinged with cautious excitement. A few staff members glanced at her with muted astonishment, aware that her swift interventions had played a significant role in stabilizing John. As Amber neared his room, she allowed herself a brief moment to compose her thoughts. Yes, she had fought for his life like any dedicated doctor would, yet an unspoken secret haunted her. The intimate goodbye kiss she'd placed on his forehead when she believed he was on the brink of death. Now, with him awake, she dreaded the possibility that he might recall that moment, or, worse, construe it in a way that jeopardized her professional integrity. In the room, John lay propped against several pillows, and the fourth line taped to his arm, monitors still blinking with the vital signs that bore testament to his miraculous turnaround. Even in the haze of convalescence, he radiated a quiet intensity, the force of his personality hard to ignore. As soon as he caught sight of Amber, his gaze locked onto hers. For a moment, words failed them both. The room seemed suspended in a hush, broken only by the soft beeps of the monitors and the hiss of oxygen flowing through the cannula in his nose. A nurse finished updating the digital chart and motioned Amber to take the lead. Drawing in a steadying breath, Amber approached the bedside, her expression composed yet kind. "Mr. Gray," she said softly, "I'm Dr. Lin. I've been overseeing your care since you were admitted." The introduction felt overly formal, considering she had nearly poured her soul into reviving him. But such clinical detachment was part of her professional shield. John tried to speak, coughed once, then managed a rough whisper. "You saved my life," he rasped, each syllable carrying a weight that made her stomach twist with humility and guilt. She nodded carefully, adjusting the angle of his bed, anything to avoid the intensity of his stare. "You had a severe infection that led to respiratory and cardiac complications," she explained. "We weren't sure if you'd pull through." Her voice caught on the final words. She hoped he wouldn't sense the raw emotion there, the memory of believing him lost and offering a last act of comfort. He studied her in silence for a few beats, taking in her slender build, her dark hair pinned back in a half-hastened bun, the shadows under her eyes that betrayed her exhaustion. "I remember flashes," he admitted quietly. "Alarms, voices, and a dream of warmth, like someone was there holding on to me. But maybe it was just delirium." Her heart stuttered, but she maintained a calm facade. "Fever dreams can feel incredibly real," she said, simply, her professional tone shielding her inner turmoil. He nodded slowly, a flicker in his gaze suggesting that perhaps he wasn't entirely convinced by her matter-of-fact explanation. Over the next hour, Amber busied herself with a thorough exam, checking his reflexes, scanning the readouts of his vitals, questioning him about any lingering pain or dizziness. John answered quietly, occasionally wincing or pausing to catch his breath. The severity of his infection had left him weakened, his once formidable aura subdued into a paler, more vulnerable version of himself. Still, the spark in his eyes had not dimmed, and each time she met his gaze, Amber felt a shiver of awareness dance along her nerves. When the nurse returned bearing a tray of medications and a light meal, Amber stepped back, granting John some space to rest. The hospital's overhead announcement system crackled to life with a routine page, but Amber could barely register the words. She had intended to slip out with minimal fuss, to let him recover in peace without lingering. But as she turned to go, his voice reached her, still hoarse but steadier. "Dr. Lin?" She stopped, hand poised on the door handle. "Yes?" His eyes flicked away, betraying an unusual uncertainty for a man reputed to be a ruthless corporate leader. I wanted to say thank you for everything. The nurses told me you worked on me for hours, and apparently you stayed even after your shift ended." A hint of a tentative smile brushed his lips. "I don't remember much, but I felt like I wasn't alone." Something about his gratitude made her chest tighten with emotion. She couldn't fully process. "I'm just doing my job," she managed, forcing a small, polite smile. "And you still have quite a bit of recovery ahead. Let's just get you better, okay?" He nodded, a subtle sense of disappointment flashing across his features before he carefully masked it. "Yeah," he said softly, "let's do that." Amber stepped into the corridor, her thoughts swirling as she made her way back to the staff lounge. Each step echoed with conflicting emotions: relief that he was alive, unease about how she'd let her compassion cross an unspoken boundary that night, and a curious pull toward the man behind the steel-gray eyes. None of it fit neatly into the world she'd inhabited thus far, the world of precise diagnosis, clinical outcomes, and professional detachment. But something in her gut told her that, like it or not, a single kiss given in farewell could spark ripples far beyond her wildest imagining. Later that evening, she retreated to the dim on-call room she'd claimed as a makeshift bedroom. Sleep eluded her, memories of John's near-lifeless body surfacing each time she closed her eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that a fundamental shift had occurred in the ICU, a moment where compassion transcended professional courtesy. That fleeting kiss might never come to light, and perhaps it was best left that way. Yet the uneasy flutter in her chest insisted it was just the beginning. Fate, it seemed, had intervened in the shape of one desperate goodbye gesture, and there was no telling how far that thread might lead. Even as exhaustion neared, Amber resolved to face whatever consequences arose from this strange intersection of her life and John's. She couldn't forget the way his eyes had locked on hers that afternoon, nor the gratitude that shone through his pain. Perhaps it was adrenaline, or maybe something deeper, a resonance between two souls who had brushed against mortality's edge. In the stillness of the hospital night, she made a silent promise to walk this path bravely, wherever it might take her. Unbeknownst to her, forces beyond her control were already at play, setting the stage for an even more shocking chapter in their story, one that would test the boundaries of compassion, challenge the meaning of loyalty, and ultimately bring two broken hearts under the same roof in a moment of pure, unguarded love. Amber tried to maintain her usual composure in the days that followed John's miraculous awakening. Long hours in the ICU corridors blurred together, punctuated by the measured chaos of beeping monitors, urgent pages over the intercom, and the constant rush of nurses and orderlies. Yet beneath the facade of calm professionalism, her thoughts kept drifting to the moment she had pressed that final kiss to John's forehead, believing he hovered at the precipice of death. She wondered if he remembered anything about that night, if he sensed the quiet desperation that had compelled her to cross an invisible line between doctor and patient. Every morning, Amber stopped by John's room to review his progress, watchful not to linger too long or give anyone reason to question her heightened interest in his recovery. She stuck to the script of a concerned physician. She checked his vitals, noted changes in his blood work, and updated his treatment plan with meticulous care. But even those brief encounters crackled with a tension that neither of them could ignore. Each time she caught his gaze, she felt a jolt of unspoken recognition, a shared secret that lingered in the charged air. In those moments, a subtle heat rose to her cheeks, and she saw a flicker in his eyes, a guarded curiosity, as though he was trying to recall something just beyond the edges of his memory. One particularly exhausting afternoon, she found him sitting upright in bed, flipping through a magazine with forced nonchalance. Pale sunlight spilled through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the crisp hospital linens. His color was returning, albeit slowly, and the dark circles beneath his eyes had lessened. Amber approached cautiously, her heart thumping. She was keenly aware that she was off shift and wore only a simple sweater and jeans rather than her usual white coat, an image that might raise eyebrows if any superiors spotted her. But she couldn't quell the pull that had brought her here for one more check-in before heading home. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, trying to steady her pulse. She kept her voice low, aware of another patient's monitor beeping somewhere down the corridor. John paused as if weighing his words, then he set the magazine aside. "Better," he admitted, his tone subdued but honest. "I'm breathing easier. Still, the doctors say it might be a while before I'm fully out of the woods." He offered her a faint smile, a ghost of the formidable businessman image he once projected. Not used to feeling this powerless. A wave of empathy swelled in Amber. She understood how humiliating it could feel to have one's body rebel, to face the realization that no amount of money or influence could protect against the fragility of flesh and bone. She took a seat in the chair beside his bed, the hush between them a reminder of the unspoken boundary they were both teetering upon. "It takes courage to accept help," she said gently. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is surrender. Let your body heal at its own pace." John fiddled with the blanket, a flicker of apprehension crossing his features. "I keep having these flashes," he murmured. "From the night I came in, everything's jumbled. Sometimes I think I remember voices. And once, I swear I felt someone's lips against my skin. But that had to be a dream, right?" He glanced up, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. Amber's stomach twisted in knots for a second. She feared he'd corner her with a direct accusation, or that her guilt would broadcast itself in a flushed face and trembling words. "It could be," she managed, forcing a measured calm into her tone. "In cases of extreme illness, especially with fever and sedation, patients often experience vivid hallucinations. The mind fills in gaps with any comfort it can." She prayed that her explanation sounded plausible, that he couldn't hear the thudding of her heart. He scrutinized her in silence, perhaps detecting a tremor in her voice or the unease swirling in her eyes. Still, he let the matter drop, nodding pensively. Relief washed over Amber, though it was short-lived. She was about to stand, to exit gracefully and preserve what remained of her composure, when the door to John's room slid open. An imposing man with close-cropped hair and a tailored charcoal suit entered, exuding the silent arrogance of a person accustomed to dominion. Amber recognized him at once. From her limited glimpses of the hospital rumor mill, Caleb Alden, CFO of Gray Tech Innovations. Tall and cold-eyed, he acknowledged her presence with barely concealed disdain before turning to John. "We need to talk," he said curtly. "Company business can't wait forever, even if you're, well, incapacitated." John's jaw tightened, but he gestured for Amber to remain, a subtle request not to leave him alone in this confrontation. Caleb's lip curled ever so slightly at the sight of a mere doctor in the conversation, but he launched into a barrage of updates. Technical deadlines missed, investor confidence wavering. As Caleb spoke, Amber could sense the tension mounting in John, whose face betrayed a storm of frustration. "I'm fighting to get back on my feet," John bit out, voice strained. "The company can't depend on me for everything. That's why we have a board and executives, isn't it?" The CFO's response was a mix of scorn and caution. "Leadership from you is non-negotiable, John. Our next product launch hinges on your presence. Investors are spooked. Meanwhile, I'm hearing ridiculous theories about why you collapsed in the first place. The press is sniffing around, digging for any sign of scandal or weakness. They want a story." Caleb cast a cutting glance at Amber, as though implying that this young doctor was part of that potential story. Amber bristled at his insinuation, but remained silent. She could feel John's tension bleed into the room's atmosphere, thickening the already charged air. Caleb continued, "Some say your meltdown was a result of your own reckless lifestyle. Others are spinning rumors that you were alone in a locked room, that something hush-hush happened leading up to your hospitalization." His stare was pointed, a silent accusation that Amber found chilling. John's nostrils flared, his hand clenching the edge of the hospital bed. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "We both know I've dedicated everything to Gray's success. If I needed space or some privacy, that's my right as a human being." Caleb's smug expression hinted he'd already gleaned enough to suspect there was more behind John's collapse than just a medical emergency. Sensing the conversation was inching into precarious territory, Amber cleared her throat and rose. "Mr. Gray still needs rest," she said firmly, mustering her best clinical detachment. "Stress will only hamper his recovery." Caleb gave her an icy glare that spoke volumes of how little he valued her opinion. John, however, seized the opening. "We'll discuss the company's status in due time, Alden," he said coldly. "For now, leave us." After a long, tense pause, Caleb inclined his head with a theatrical air of reluctance, then stalked out, letting the door hiss shut behind him. The silence that followed felt loaded, as if the room itself had breathed a sigh of relief. Amber turned back to John, finding him gazing at her with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, a raw, unspoken curiosity. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he murmured, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "The corporate world can be vicious. Caleb is just a taste of it." Her lips curved in a sympathetic, sad smile. "I've seen family members fight over hospital bills in the waiting room. I'm no stranger to conflict, but that was intense." For a moment, a fragile closeness flickered between them. Here was a man grappling with the weight of an empire, even as his own body struggled to heal. And she was the doctor, whose single impulsive kiss might shape the next chapter of both their lives. The tension in her chest told her it was time to go. She was risking her professional boundaries by lingering, yet it felt heartless to leave him alone with corporate predators and his own swirling doubts. He seemed to sense her hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly, voice laden with earnestness, "for looking out for me, for caring about more than just the lab numbers." She swallowed the knot in her throat. "I'm your doctor, that's my job." A whispered thought, however, slipped unspoken between them. "It's more than that." Unable to fully articulate it, she merely offered him a nod and slipped out of the room, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. Yet even after the door separated them, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were becoming inexorably interwoven, that a single act of compassion was pulling them into a story far beyond her imagination. Outside, the hospital corridor bustled with its usual array of beeping machines and hurried footsteps. Another shift change would soon arrive, and Amber had to prepare for a new wave of patients. But before she dove back into the maelstrom of medical demands, she paused by a window overlooking the hospital courtyard below. Nurses chatted during a brief respite, visitors clustered with anxious faces. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, her reflection overlaid with the city lights. That fleeting kiss she'd given, the one believed to be a final farewell, now lingered like a promise yet to be fulfilled, a pivot point that could lead to salvation or heartbreak. She exhaled slowly, her breath clouding the window, and whispered to herself that she'd face whatever came next with open eyes. Little did she know, fate was already aligning a series of shocks and breakthroughs, a path of surprising revelations, corporate rivalries, and a romance tested by powers beyond her control. And at the center of it all stood John Gray, the man who refused to let her slip from his life as easily as she'd slipped from his hospital room. Amber stood in the private break room of Nightingale General Hospital, her fingertips gently tracing the rim of a paper coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago. The buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of rolling hospital carts felt oddly amplified in her ears. She was supposed to be off duty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something pivotal was about to happen, something that wouldn't allow her the luxury of heading home for the night. Ever since John had awakened and proved everyone wrong by pulling through his dire prognosis, the hospital corridors had swirled with talk of him, the elusive CEO, whose life she had fought so hard to save. Yet none of the rumors hinted at the most intimate detail of all, the tender parting kiss she had given him in a moment of desperation. She finished her lukewarm coffee with a grimace and discarded the cup, mentally steeling herself to check in on him once more before she finally clocked out. Her heart thudded with anticipation. The last time she'd approached John's room, she'd witnessed him standing by the window, gripping the fourth stand for support, while defiantly staring at the city lights. His recovery was remarkable, fueled by a fierce will that matched the stories of his corporate prowess. And yet, beneath his newly regained strength, Amber sensed an unspoken vulnerability, a quiet yearning that mirrored her own. In the corridor, she found a small cluster of nurses whispering about John and the secrets that seemed to surround his sudden collapse. Some speculated about corporate sabotage, others believed it was pure exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional, finally catching up to a man rumored never to sleep. Amber caught fragments of their hushed conversation. "Did you hear?" he demanded all visitors be screened. "He's expecting some hush-hush meeting. The CFO was here earlier, stormed off looking furious. I bet it's about the company's next move. The weird part is how Dr. Lin's always so protective of him. You think there's something between them?" She forced herself to walk past with steady steps, feigning disinterest. It stung to hear speculation about her professional boundaries, especially when half of her shift had been consumed by her attempts to keep an emotional distance. She was determined to maintain a clinical veneer, even while her heart waged a rebellion every time she was near John. Still, the rumors pricked at her conscience. She wondered how close they were to uncovering the truth of that kiss. Rounding the corner, Amber paused outside John's room. The door was partially ajar, giving her a glimpse of the man inside, sitting upright, frowning at a cluster of documents spread across a rolling hospital tray. She noted the tension in his shoulders, the frustration that radiated from him. A pang of empathy coursed through her, He might have survived physically, but it was evident that the corporate world hadn't paused to let him heal in peace. She quietly tapped on the door. John looked up, and for a fraction of a second, relief flashed in his eyes. "Dr. Lin," he greeted, his voice steadier than before, though still tinged with the strain of recovery. "Come in." She entered, carefully shutting the door behind her. "Working again? I see," she said, letting a touch of gentle reprimand creep into her tone. "Shouldn't you be resting, Mr. Gray?" She kept her arms folded, a weak defense against the flutter in her chest, when he offered her that subdued half-smile. He shrugged, gesturing to the documents. Some kind of strategic plan for a Grey-Tech project that lay abandoned in the chaos of my hospitalization. I have to at least review these. My CFO is pushing for an emergency board meeting. Investors are anxious. But then, "I'm fine," he added almost too quickly, as if trying to convince himself. "I'm itching to get out of here." Amber sighed. "You might feel better, but your blood panels still show we need to monitor you. Another infection would set you back drastically. Pushing too fast is exactly how you ended up in this bed." Her voice held an edge of concern that slid perilously close to warmth, an inflection she usually reserved for patients she'd grown personally attached to, patients like him, though she refused to articulate that thought. He exhaled, letting his gaze fall to the scattered papers. "I know. Believe it or not, I'm listening to you." Then, hesitating, he continued in a quieter tone. "Sometimes I catch glimpses of that night I nearly, died. They're hazy, but there's a constant thread, a sense that someone was there, comforting me. If you weren't pressed by professional codes, I'd almost ask if it was you." Amber's chest tightened. She masked her reaction with a crisp, practiced neutrality. "I was on duty, yes. Like I said, it's normal for patients to experience illusions when critically ill. All that sedation and oxygen can induce the strangest dreams." She held his gaze, praying he wouldn't push further, that he wouldn't notice the faint trembling in her hands. If he remembered the kiss, or glimpsed a second of that last act of compassion, their precarious relationship would be even more complicated. "I suppose so," he replied, searching her face. A charged pause followed, the silence brimming with the unacknowledged tension between them. Then he ventured, "Look, I'd like to discuss something else." He gestured toward the documents. "I'm concerned about the board's reaction to my illness. People are talking about my capacity to lead. Some might even suspect foul play. And then there's Caleb Alden, my CFO, who's been pushing some hidden agenda. I feel cornered, and strangely, I feel like I can only trust you." "Is that crazy?" Amber's heart pounded. She wanted to recoil from such personal trust, yet felt an undeniable pull to reciprocate. "We hardly know each other," she pointed out softly, her voice wavering. "Yet we do share a bond, I guess. I've been with you through what might have been your final hours." She hadn't meant to reveal such honesty, but once the words were spoken, she realized it was the truth. However improbable, their lives had become entwined by tragedy. John's eyes flickered with an emotion she couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude and longing. "I want you to help me find out how I ended up in this state," he confessed at last. "My illness wasn't just random. My personal physician insists we should look deeper. Someone might have known about my chronic condition and let it worsen. There's a lot of money at stake, a lot of corporate loyalty that can be bought. I've pissed off enough people to suspect a sabotage." He paused, the gravity of his theory a chill in the room. "Would you help me unravel this, even if it means stepping beyond your usual role?" Shock washed over her. She had expected more bedside confessions about fear, or a request for additional medical clarity, not an appeal for detective work. Yet the vulnerability in his eyes told her this was more than corporate paranoia. Something had shaken him deeply enough to break the shell of stoicism and reach out to a woman he'd known for only a handful of weeks, yet who had literally saved his life. Amber wavered, her professional instincts battling the empathy she felt around him. "You're serious?" she murmured, half disbelieving. He nodded, deadly serious. A bitter smile touched his lips. Pardon the pun. For several seconds she could only stare. Then, with a steadiness that masked the swirl of her thoughts, she drew in a breath. "All right, I can. Well, I can keep my eyes open. Talk to staff. See if anything stands out in your medical records. But you need to promise me you won't push yourself over the edge again. I won't watch you ruin yourself a second time." His posture relaxed marginally, a wave of relief evident in his exhale. "Deal," he said softly. "Trust me, after nearly dying, I'm not eager for a repeat." The conversation ended abruptly when a nurse, flustered and out of breath, stepped inside to administer a routine check on John. Amber used the interruption to slip away, though her mind buzzed with countless questions. She made her way down the corridor, occasionally nodding to passing colleagues who gave her curious glances. She felt a sudden urge to delve into John's medical history, to discern whether indeed something suspicious lurked behind his collapse. But a deeper, more complicated emotion tugged at her too, the sensation of stepping irrevocably across a boundary. As a doctor, she was bound by ethical guidelines, but as a woman enthralled by fate's inexplicable hand, she found herself walking the edge of moral tightrope. The rest of her shift was consumed by standard duties, treating pneumonia cases, stabilizing a stroke victim, consoling anxious families in the waiting area. Yet through it all, John's request overshadowed her usual methodical focus. By the time she shrugged on her coat to leave for the night, a subtle thrill mingled with guilt thrummed in her veins. She wondered if she'd see him again, if he'd ask her for more. The memory of him pale and clinging to life no longer dominated her mind. Instead, she envisioned the man awake and watchful, and her secret knowledge of that final kiss weighed on her heart like a promise she couldn't yet comprehend. After stepping out into the brisk twilight, Amber stood on the hospital steps, a city of neon and concrete thrumming around her. Had fate truly intervened in that ICU, tangling two lives together for a purpose neither fully understood? The thought sent a shiver of apprehension and excitement down her spine. Clutching her bag against her side, she headed home under the city lights, aware that her world was changing, though she couldn't foresee the heartbreak, the peril, and the fierce love that awaited her beyond this night. Amber found little peace in the week that followed her clandestine conversation with John. Though she threw herself into her hospital duties, treating flu outbreaks, stabilizing a teenage accident victim, and consoling a tearful family whose loved one lay in the ICU, her mind kept returning to the cryptic possibility of foul play that John had raised. She knew she was no detective. Her expertise lay in medicine, in understanding the intricacies of the human body, in saving lives with clinical precision. Yet each time she spotted John's name on the patient roster or heard a passing nurse mention him, she felt an uneasy tug in her heart, a reminder that behind his near-fatal collapse might lurk unseen malice. One late afternoon, after an especially grueling shift, Amber slipped into the hospital's records room. The space was quiet, populated by rows of filing cabinets and a handful of computer terminals that offered digital access to patient histories. Her official justification for being there was to update some ongoing case notes, but in truth, she was drawn by the urge to revisit John's files. Even a cursory look might illuminate something off, a test result that had been overlooked, an anomaly that might support his suspicions. She found a secluded terminal, logging in with her ID and password. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the only background noise besides the distant hum of the hospital air circulation system. With a sense of mounting trepidation, she pulled up John's medical profile. The digital chart displayed rows of data, lab results, scans, physician notes from the days prior to and following his collapse. She combed through them systematically, resisting the guilt that nudged at her for straying outside her usual bounds. At first glance, it all seemed straightforward, a severe infection that had gone undetected until it reached a critical stage, then triggered complications in his heart and lungs. But as she dug deeper, a nagging detail leaped out at her. Certain medication levels were oddly high in his bloodstream the day he was admitted. The notes indicated a prescribed regimen, yet nowhere could she find a legitimate doctor's order that matched the dosage discovered. Moreover, a second set of lab results, time-stamped hours before he was rushed in, bore a nurse's initials she didn't recognize. The notes about who administered the medication, if it had even been administered legally, were either absent or inconsistent. Amber's pulse quickened. The discrepancy might signal an honest mistake, but given John's claims of sabotage, it raised a chilling prospect. Someone might have deliberately manipulated his medication. She printed off the relevant pages, heart pounding with an uneasy mix of thrill and apprehension. If she was right, this was more than just a corporate rival trying to tarnish John's image. This might be an attempt on his life. And if so, Amber was stepping into a realm far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Stepping out of the records room, she nearly collided with a passing coworker. The nurse, Emma, a friend who had shared countless shifts with Amber, raised her eyebrows in mild curiosity. "You okay?" Emma asked, noticing the tense grip Amber had on the printed sheets. Amber forced a quick, dismissive smile. "Yeah, just double-checking some details on a complex case," she lied, hoping the nurse wouldn't pry. Emma gave an understanding nod, then hurried off to her next task. Amber exhaled, her mind spinning with the gravity of her discovery. That evening, when her shift finally ended, she found herself standing outside John's private room. Once more, the pages folded discreetly inside a file folder. Through the small window in the door, she saw him dozing lightly. A surge of protectiveness welled in her chest. Here was the man she had nearly lost, the same man who had entrusted her with a secret suspicion, and now she was holding the puzzle piece that might confirm his darkest fears. Yet she hesitated. If she told him what she'd found, it could spark a chain reaction she wasn't prepared to handle. Rival executives, corporate sharks, the hospital's own administration, any or all might push back against revelations that a hospital staffer had discovered evidence of foul play. Still, she knocked gently and entered. John stirred, opening his eyes to see her standing there, her expression guarded but resolute. "Can I come in?" she asked in a soft voice. He managed a weary smile. "Any time," he replied, shifting to sit up more fully. She set the file folder on a small side table, then drew closer to the bed, speaking in a low tone. "I did some digging," she confessed, voice trembling just enough to betray her nerves. "What you suspected, there might be something to it. Irregularities in your medication records the day you were admitted. A nurse's initials I can't place anywhere else, unexplained dosages that never got an official prescription." John's expression darkened, his hand clenching the hospital blanket. "So I wasn't just paranoid." The bitterness in his words stung. "Someone wanted me out of the picture, or at least incapacitated enough to manipulate the company behind my back." Caleb Alden, a silent competitor. There are too many possibilities. Amber perched on the edge of a nearby chair, her own heart racing. "We can't leap to conclusions, but the evidence is there. I was thinking I might question the pharmacy staff, see if they recall unusual orders. But if I do, it raises suspicion about why I'm involved at all." She paused, unsure of how he would react to her plan, or if he even wanted her to be this deeply embroiled. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I never wanted to drag you into my corporate mess," he admitted, a note of remorse creeping into his tone. "But we're past that now, aren't we?" Meeting her eyes, he offered a crooked half-smile that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and sadness. "Just be careful, Amber. Anyone who's gone this far wouldn't hesitate to silence you if they realized you're onto them." Her stomach twisted at the warning, yet resolve tightened in her chest. "I'll watch my step, but you watch yours too. Keep your guard up." For a moment, they shared a quiet understanding, two individuals thrust together by an encounter that defied reason, determined to uncover the truth even if it endangered them both. John reached out, his fingers lightly brushing hers in a gesture of solidarity. It was a touch that made her heart skip, a reminder that beyond the swirl of conspiracy and dread, something more personal had bloomed between them. Their brief respite was shattered by the buzz of an incoming message on John's phone. He glanced at the screen and grimaced. "That's Alden. Says the board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow morning. They're pressing me to sign off on decisions I haven't even reviewed." This is exactly what I feared. She could almost see the tension coil around him like a vice, the lines of exhaustion marring his features, a testament that his body was far from fully healed. Yet she also witnessed the flicker of determination that made him a formidable CEO. "I'll do what I can from this end," Amber murmured. "But your health," he silenced her with a resigned nod. I know. One crisis at a time." The corners of his mouth curved into a tired smirk that lacked true humor. "I just never dreamed that cheating death would only lead me into a new battlefield. But I'm not giving up. Not on the company, not on—" He hesitated, eyes flicking to her, his voice catching. "Anything." She rose to leave, heart thudding at the raw honesty in his words. The hush that settled between them felt laden with possibilities, confessions unspoken, attachments they were too cautious to name. "Rest," she advised quietly, giving him a meaningful look. "I'll check on you soon, and hopefully we can figure out more. We'll do it carefully. We're dealing with dangerous people." John simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her as though she were the one anchor he could trust in a turbulent sea. Slipping back into the corridor, Amber inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the file folder in her grasp, the proof that malice, not just misfortune, might have brought John to the brink of death. Her role as a dedicated doctor was now entangled with a quest for truth and perhaps justice, and in the quiet echo of her footsteps down the corridor, she couldn't deny the spark of something more than duty that drove her forward, an undercurrent of affection for the man whose life she saved with a final desperate kiss. With each step, she promised herself that she wouldn't let fear or an unnamed saboteur destroy what fragile bond they had begun to forge. The path ahead was fraught with unknown perils, but her resolve had never been stronger. She would defend John's life a second time if necessary, even against forces that lurked in the shadows of the very hospital meant to heal. The day of the emergency board meeting dawned beneath a sky, the color of slate, clouds lurking over the city's skyline, as though mirroring the tension that simmered just beneath the surface of Nightingale General Hospital's routine bustle. Amber arrived earlier than usual, slipping through the main doors before the shift change could swamp the corridors with rushed nurses and half-awake interns. Though she wore her standard white coat and carried her usual stethoscope, her mind was far from standard hospital procedure. After her discovery of the irregularities in John's medication records, she'd spent every spare moment wrestling with the ethical and personal implications of pushing deeper into this mystery. She had arranged to meet John in a quiet corner of the hospital's rehabilitative wing, an area still under renovation and thus lightly staffed. When she reached the small lounge they'd chosen for privacy, she found him waiting, his wheelchair positioned near a wide window that overlooked the parking lot. The morning light cast his features in sharp relief. The faint shadows under his eyes betrayed lingering weakness, but determination radiated from his posture. Amber's heart clenched at the sight. Even confined to a wheelchair, he projected an air of steeled authority, as though ready to face the corporate sharks awaiting him at Gray's board meeting. "Amber," he greeted softly, nodding his thanks as she took hold of the wheelchair handles to push him into a more secluded alcove. "I see you got my message. I didn't want to face this day without talking to you first." His eyes met hers with a flicker of relief and something more, a glimmer of the bond that had grown in the hush of hospital nights. She set the brake on the wheelchair and crouched beside him, her lab coat brushing the polished floor. "It sounded urgent," she replied. "And after everything we've uncovered, urgent might be an understatement." He exhaled, as though gathering his courage. "The board convenes in less than 2 hours. Caleb Alden called me at dawn, demanding I show up in body if not in spirit. He said if I don't appear, rumors will multiply that I'm too weak to lead. But if I do show up, I'm stepping into a potential ambush. Either way, I can't let them push me out without a fight." His gaze flicked to the envelope on his lap, containing the suspicious medication records. Amber had found. "I might have to reveal this. Show them I have reason to suspect foul play. Let them know I'm not merely paranoid." A knot formed in Amber's stomach. That's a risky move. If the board gets wind that you're accusing someone within your own company, they might close ranks. You still don't know exactly who tampered with your medications, just that a discrepancy exists. She paused, hesitant. "But if you have no choice, you could at least corner them into an investigation. If they refuse, it's on them." John nodded, the earlier tension in his jawline softening at her pragmatic suggestion. "That's exactly what I needed to hear," he admitted. "I'm still not fully recovered. Any sign of hesitation on my part will be interpreted as weakness or a lie. We have to handle this with absolute conviction." A fleeting smile touched his lips. "It helps knowing you're in my corner." She swallowed, her eyes lingering on the envelope. "We only have half the story. Make sure you frame it that way. Explain how the hospital staff discovered anomalies, that you almost died from an overshoot of certain meds with no official prescription. Don't accuse specifically unless you have more proof. Caleb may be orchestrating it, or it could be someone else entirely. Let them reveal themselves under the pressure." Even as she spoke, Amber felt the weight of stepping beyond her professional bounds. She was an intensivist, not a corporate operative. Yet the gravity of John's predicament and the memory of that night, the final kiss that sparked her sense of responsibility, drove her to keep helping him. As if sensing her unease, John reached out and gently enclosed her hand in his. I promise, once this is resolved, once I have my company secure again, I'll handle everything properly. I won't let your name get dragged through the mud for assisting me. I couldn't bear that." His tone was soft, yet threaded with conviction that sent warmth coursing through her chest. Their moment of closeness was shattered by the echo of footsteps in the corridor. They stiffened, turning as a nurse passed by, politely but curiously glancing their way. Amber quickly rose, releasing John's hand. They waited in tense silence until the nurse vanished from view. Then Amber sighed, forcing a thin smile. "I need to return to my rounds. You should head to that board meeting soon. Don't push yourself physically. If you feel dizzy or short of breath, you must slow down." She paused, lips curving in a tremulous smile that carried 1,000 unspoken emotions. "Please promise me that." He nodded, rolling the envelope in his lap. "I promise. And Amber, if something goes wrong today, I want to thank you for saving me in more ways than one." That final statement weighed heavily in the air, a quiet testament to the transformations that had occurred between them since the night she believed he was dying. Leaving him there was unexpectedly painful. As Amber walked away, her footsteps reverberated through the corridor, a fresh wave of conflict assailing her thoughts. She had never asked to be entangled in high-stakes corporate machinations, yet here she was, a simple doctor who had once believed she might lose a nameless patient, and who now found herself playing confidant to a powerful CEO embroiled in sabotage and conspiracies. And overshadowing all of it was the fragile yet intense undercurrent of personal connection blossoming between them, a connection forged in the darkest hours of near death and secret kisses. Her day blurred into the usual hospital chaos. She assessed postoperative patients, consulted on a complex pulmonary case, and carried out a delicate intubation in the ER. Yet with every free moment, her mind drifted to John's predicament. She imagined him facing the board's aggressive questions, confronting Caleb Alden's cool hostility, and standing alone in a battlefield that might drain him of what little energy his body had managed to regain. Toward the evening, as Amber finally allowed herself to slip out of the hospital, she checked her phone for messages. Nothing from John, no updates about the meeting. A pang of worry flared. The quiet autumn breeze rustled the trees lining the hospital driveway. The sky had faded to a soft indigo studded with faint stars. She felt a tug to go to him, to knock on his penthouse door or find him at the hospital if he'd returned. But she hesitated, uncertain if imposing her presence might appear desperate or jeopardize her professional standing even further. Ultimately, she chose to head home, her emotions churning. Seated on her small apartment sofa, Amber scrolled aimlessly through medical journals on her laptop, the pages failing to hold her attention. Her mind was awash with endless what-ifs. What if John's revelations unleashed a corporate war that threatened them both? What if the saboteur already guessed her involvement and sought to silence her? Perhaps the scariest question of all was more personal. How much of herself was she willing to risk for a man she barely knew, yet whose life had become inextricably bound to her own? As the night stretched on, Amber succumbed to restless sleep, dreams flickering with images of hospital corridors turning into endless mazes, of John striding away from her into swirling shadows, and of her holding a file of incriminating evidence that burned hot in her hands. It was a fitful doze, haunted by the awareness that dawn might bring either resolution or deeper chaos. Yet even within those uneasy dreams, a persistent warmth remained, the memory of a final desperate kiss that had ignited a flame she couldn't smother. When Amber awakened the next morning, shadows of uneasy dreams clung to her. She had slept poorly, plagued by images of hospital corridors warping into endless mazes, with John drifting further away from her, no matter how quickly she ran. Now, under the pale light of early dawn, she took a moment to gather her bearings in the modest calm of her apartment, a small living area, the aroma of stale coffee, medical textbooks scattered across a wobbly dining table. Her mind churned with half-formed worries. She had heard nothing from John since he'd left for the emergency board meeting, and the silence stoked her anxiety. What if something had gone horribly wrong? By the time she reached Nightingale General Hospital, the day shift chaos was in full swing. She navigated bustling corridors, returning quick greetings from familiar nurses, all the while checking her phone for any update from John. Nothing. Her gut twisted as she recalled the tension in his voice, the determined light in his eyes when he spoke of confronting potential betrayal. She replayed his final words in the hospital lounge, how he said he'd stand up to the board, brandishing the incriminating evidence she'd uncovered in his medical files. What if revealing such information had backfired spectacularly? An hour into her shift, Amber's phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number. Heart pounding, she ducked into a quiet alcove near the radiology department and answered in a hushed tone. "Hello?" A faint crackle. Then she heard him, John, sounding weary yet alive. "Amber, it's me." Relief flooded her veins so swiftly she almost sank against the wall. Before she could speak, John continued, his voice taut with restrained emotion. "I left a million messages, but they must not have gone through. My meeting," he paused, exhaling shakily. "Let's just say it took a turn. I never saw coming. I need to see you. I'm at the hospital entrance. Can you slip away?" A flicker of alarm and curiosity flared inside her. "Give me a few minutes." She ended the call, mind racing. She had cleared the next half hour in her schedule for chart updates. Maybe she could repurpose that block for a private conversation. She took a deep breath to steady herself, then briskly informed a colleague she'd be unavailable for a short while. When Amber stepped outside, the crisp autumn air slapped her awake. The hospital's entrance bustled with visitors, and on the far side of the walkway, she spotted John leaning against a sleek, black sedan. Her lungs tightened at the sight of him standing upright, without a wheelchair, though he leaned heavily on a cane. His features looked drawn, as though he hadn't slept, but there was a fierce determination lurking beneath the fatigue. She hurried over, scanning him for any obvious signs of physical distress. "You shouldn't be on your feet like this," she scolded gently, but her concern dwarfed any hint of reproach. "Are you okay? What happened at the board meeting?" John straightened, his gaze locked on hers with intensity. I confronted them," he began haltingly, glancing warily around to ensure no one hovered within earshot. "Showed the medication records, hinted strongly that someone from the company orchestrated my near downfall. At first, they were all surprise and concern, Alden included. But then, he trailed off, jaw tightening as if the memory seared him. Amber's breath caught. Then what? "They turned it around on me," John said, bitter frustration coating each syllable. Alden produced a counterfeit set of documents claiming I self-administered multiple drugs under stress, suggesting I was unfit to lead. The board's sympathy evaporated. They're painting me as an erratic leader who nearly overdosed in some meltdown, because apparently me doing it to myself is more plausible than sabotage. By the meeting's end, they'd basically demanded I take an indefinite leave of absence as CEO. Her stomach sank at the injustice. "But you have evidence of tampering. You have the labs. You can prove there was no official prescription for those meds. That the nurse's initials." He lifted a trembling hand, cutting her off. "They claim the nurse's name is real, but that she's on an extended leave, unreachable. Allege she was under my private employ. Some twisted story that I orchestrated it for pity or to manipulate stock prices. It's insane, but they hammered home with enough confusion to cast doubt, and it worked. The board is calling an emergency vote next week to decide if I'm permanently removed." Amber felt anger and fear coil in her chest. That can't be legal. And the press, won't they see right through it? John barked a hollow laugh. "Alden's cunning enough to spin any story. Right now, if the public sees me as a reckless CEO who nearly killed himself, they might well buy into the narrative that I'm unstable. Meanwhile, the real plotter gets away scot-free." His shoulders sagged, and for a fleeting second, Amber glimpsed a profound weariness. She bit her lip, heart racing. This had escalated far beyond suspicious medication charts. He took a deep breath, eyes flicking to the hospital's grand facade. "That's why I need you now more than ever, Amber," he said, voice trembling with a rare vulnerability that made her heart twist. "I know it's not fair to drag you deeper, but you're the only person I trust completely. We've got to find that nurse, confirm the tampering, or at least force the truth out in a way that no one can deny." For a moment, Amber struggled to respond, torn between her professional ethics and a surging personal devotion she could no longer deny. The memory of their moments together, his near death, that final kiss, the conspiratorial nights in which they'd uncovered unsettling details, flashed in her mind. She inhaled slowly, steeling herself for what might come next. "I'll do what I can," she promised, voice quiet but resolute. "If that nurse is real, or if those records can be authenticated, maybe we can overturn this twisted narrative. But we'll have to tread carefully. Alden sounds ruthless. He'll burn everything down to protect himself. A fleeting spark of gratitude lit John's face. "I won't forget this," he whispered, leaning slightly on the cane. "I owe you more than you can imagine." His voice held a haunted undertone, reminding Amber of how precarious his life had been mere days ago. He hesitated, then gently brushed his fingers against hers, a silent echo of the connection that had grown between them. She allowed herself the slightest squeeze in return, mindful of prying eyes. "Let's get you inside," she murmured. "We can't have you collapsing out here." Together, they slipped back into the hospital's thrumming interior. She guided him down a lesser-used hallway to avoid curious staff, eventually finding a small, unoccupied consultation room. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a clinical glow on the metal exam table and shelves lined with medical equipment. John settled on a stool, wincing as he shifted his weight from the cane. Amber locked the door behind them, her heartbeat hammering at the clandestine nature of this meeting. The precarious line she was walking between professionalism and something entirely more personal. He handed her a slim envelope. "This is the only evidence I have left," he said. "Original blood work results. Your initial notes from that night. Stuff that, for now, only you and a couple of loyal staff have seen." Amber rifled through the contents, verifying the authenticity of the lab results. Her chest tightened at the knowledge that if these documents leaked, it might not only jeopardize John's future, but her own credibility at the hospital. "I'll keep them safe," she murmured, "but this alone won't be enough to convict anyone. We need to confirm who administered the meds, who used that nurse's initials, or if they're actually a real nurse. If it's an alias, we might trace it to Alden or his cronies." John nodded, though his gaze lingered on her face, eyes gleaming with a mixture of gratitude and, she couldn't help but sense, affection. "I never expected fate to bind me to a doctor who believed I was as good as dead," he said. Softly, his voice laced with both humor and melancholy. The words carried an unspoken reference to the moment Amber believed might have been his last on Earth, the moment she offered him that fateful kiss. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but maintained a composed front. "Neither did I," she whispered, unsure if he recalled that exact detail or simply perceived an unspoken closeness. "But I'm here now, and we'll see this through." Before either could venture further, a rap sounded on the door, making them both jump. Amber's heart lurched. Swiftly, she concealed the envelope under some hospital forms. John leaned more heavily on the cane, trying to appear as though they were merely discussing his care. She opened the door a crack to find a nurse with urgent eyes, needing her signature for a transfer. Amber forced a polite nod and told the nurse she'd be out in a moment. As soon as the door was shut again, the tension in the room prickled anew. "You should go," John murmured, voice low. "I don't want to rouse suspicion. We'll reconvene later." She bit her lip, acutely aware of how every moment with him threatened to entangle them deeper in a web of rumors. Yet neither could deny that their bond, forged in the crucible of a near-death experience, now carried them into a shared fight against a hidden enemy. If the man truly responsible for orchestrating John's medical sabotage was as cunning as they both feared, every step forward placed them in greater jeopardy. Amber's stomach fluttered at the thought, but a sense of purpose steadied her. "All right," she murmured, voice trembling ever so slightly. "Take it easy. If you feel short of breath or your fever spikes, page me immediately. Don't try to be a superhero." He managed a small grin, the weariness shadowing his eyes, a stark reminder of his fragile condition. "I promise," he said softly, his fingertips brushing hers in a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "And Amber, be careful. Alden and his allies may sense we're onto them. Don't let your guard down." She hesitated a moment, glancing at the subdued lines of his face and the quiet determination it held. Then, with a final nod, she slipped out of the consultation room, heart drumming with the knowledge that their entire world was poised on the brink of upheaval. The corridors hummed with routine hospital life, doctors conferring over charts, patients being wheeled to procedures, the occasional squeak of a mop bucket. Yet for Amber, every step throbbed with a new tension. Somewhere in these corridors might hide a clue that could vindicate John and unmask the saboteur. Or more ominously, the saboteur themselves could lurk, prepared to tie off loose ends by any means necessary. The day wore on, blending into night, each hour another step in the delicate ballet of life in a hospital, a dance of triage, care, and hope. Through it all, Amber's thoughts darted between the immediate needs of her patients and the overshadowing crisis that threatened both John's empire and, in a strange twist, her own sense of safety. That quiet determination she'd felt with him in the lounge solidified. No matter how murky the path ahead, she would not abandon him to fight this battle alone. Midnight found her finishing up an emergency consult in the ICU, her legs aching and eyes burning from weariness. As she stepped into the corridor's hush, she realized that in some improbable way, she was closer to John than to anyone else in the city. A man she once believed she had lost had awakened something in her, both her protective instincts as a doctor and a deeper vulnerability. She was only beginning to comprehend. Pausing by a window overlooking the moonlit parking lot, Amber stared at her reflection. A single tear slipped down her cheek, grief for her disrupted peace, fear of the conspiracy swirling around them, and yes, a fierce hope that they might carve out a future not dictated by fear or sabotage, but by the unpredictable beauty of second chances. She brushed the tear away, squaring her shoulders. Somewhere in the hospital, John fought for his life in more ways than one, and she wouldn't falter. The bond they had forged, spontaneous, fragile, and born of a final kiss that was supposed to be a farewell, was now the guiding force leading them both through the storm. The following evening, a hushed intensity gripped Nightingale General Hospital as Amber paced the hallway outside an unassuming side room. Inside, John was staging the final act of a plan they'd orchestrated together, an operation that aimed to unmask those who had conspired to nearly take his life. Exhaustion etched lines on Amber's face, yet a fierce resolve burned in her eyes. She had spent the past day collecting every shard of proof they had uncovered: the tampered medication records, the suspicious nurse's initials, and the contradictory statements Alden had fed the Grey Tech board. If this final gambit succeeded, John would reclaim his reputation and lay bare the betrayal that threatened to destroy him. If it failed, they both could pay a heavy price. Inside the dimly lit room, Simon, John's loyal personal assistant, adjusted a discreet webcam, verifying that the live feed was transmitting to a secure server. John sat upright in a wheelchair, the cane he still needed resting by his side. The day's tension showed in the taut line of his jaw, but a spark of determination danced in his eyes. Amber entered softly, her heart thudding as she absorbed the scene. A small fold-out table held a laptop with an active call interface, prepared for the remote meeting with select board members who had reluctantly agreed to hear him out once more. The hush in the air was tangible, a quiet stage set for a final confrontation. Amber slipped to John's side, offering a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked in a hushed voice. "They refused to listen when you approached them last time, and if Alden senses a trap, he'll do whatever it takes to silence you, and possibly me." John exhaled, meeting her gaze with a mixture of weariness and hope. "I can't let fear stop us now. The board needs irrefutable evidence, and we're about to give it to them publicly. I want them to see the real records, hear the truth from the hospital staff who discovered my medication tampering. Simon was able to track down the nurse who supposedly ordered those extra meds. She's ready to testify that she never wrote any prescription for me. This is our best shot." The door behind them cracked open, and in walked a woman in her early 30s, pale, her expression etched with nervousness. Her ID badge identified her as Sophia Cutler, an agency nurse who occasionally covered night shifts but who had not worked the week. John was hospitalized. She clutched a worn duffel bag stuffed with personal effects, receipts, schedules, and other documents Amber had helped her compile to prove her whereabouts during the suspected sabotage. In a quivering voice, Sophia nodded to John. "I'm ready. Let's end this lie." A digital chime from the laptop signaled the start of the virtual meeting. One by one, the icons representing Grey Tech board members flickered into view, each arranged in small windows across the screen. The final one to appear was Caleb Alden, his face blank, but eyes glinting with cold interest. Amber took up position behind the camera, arms folded, her presence a silent declaration of support. John began with an uncharacteristic quiet, giving a brief recap of his condition, his near-fatal pneumonia, and the bizarre medication inconsistencies that nearly pushed him off life's edge. Then, with unwavering calm, he produced the documents Amber had discovered, lab sheets highlighting the unexplained dosages and records indicating a nurse's name that did not match her actual shifts. Sophia Cutler stepped forward next, her voice trembling yet resolute, as she recounted how she had never been assigned to John's case, nor had she ever signed off on the medications attributed to her. The final blow came when Simon played a distorted audio snippet gleaned from an old security feed, a snippet capturing a conversation between Alden and an unidentified colleague, hinting at administering a special regimen to ensure John's downfall. The board's reaction was a kaleidoscope of gasps, murmured confusion, and outraged demands for an explanation. Alden attempted a smooth denial, claiming the audio was doctored, but panic flickered in his features as John pressed him, his voice resonating with more strength than Amber had ever heard. Alden's veneer of composure cracked under mounting pressure. He launched a desperate counterattack, accusing John of orchestrating a sympathy ruse, naming Amber as an accomplice who conveniently saved him to gain access to Greytech resources. The fury in his voice echoed the fear that now poured from him in waves. Amber felt her blood run cold at the personal assault, but she refused to falter. Marshalling her professional authority, she stepped into view, reminding the board that doctors operate under strict protocols and that her only motive was to save a life. She showed hospital logs, time-stamped, with her unwavering presence during John's darkest hours. She recounted the objective medical facts, how his vital signs plummeted, how the suspicious drug dosage was discovered mere hours before he crashed. By the time she finished, the hush on the call was deafening. Even some of Alden's once loyal allies began to eye him with fresh suspicion. Cornered, Alden snarled the final defense, claiming it was all circumstantial, but it was Sophia's statement, produced on official letterhead and accompanied by an affidavit from another staff member verifying her real location on the night in question. That struck the killing blow. The board members' voices overlapped in a chaotic fury, some calling for Alden's immediate suspension, others condemning the deception that nearly cost John his life. Alden sputtered, eyes darting as though seeking an escape route, but the digital curtain had fallen. The feed cut off abruptly, leaving behind a stunned silence in the tiny hospital room. John sank back in his wheelchair, exhaling in a long, trembling sigh. Simon stood rigidly, shoulders dropping once the tension snapped. Sophia, her part done, muttered a relieved apology and slipped out, presumably to meet with security staff who would gather her official statement. Amber approached John, heart still racing from the confrontation. He gazed up at her, expression carved with relief, gratitude, and exhaustion. "We did it," he rasped, a disbelieving smile ghosting across his lips. "They can't deny the evidence any longer." She nodded, a similar mixture of triumph and fatigue swirling in her chest. "I don't know what happens next, but you'll at least have the chance to clear your name and retake your rightful position." A wave of emotion she'd held at bay threatened to spill over. The entire ordeal had culminated in this singular moment of victory, but it had also brought them dangerously close in ways that defied logical explanation. She remembered how it all began, with her bleak assumption that he was a lost cause, a final kiss that was never meant to be discovered. Now, as they stood in the aftermath of their truth-telling, that memory pulsed between them like an unspoken vow. Simon, the assistant, quietly exited to handle the hospital security forms, leaving them alone. Amber and John locked eyes, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights highlighting the silence that stretched. She felt the prickling heat of unshed tears, realized for the first time that she had been holding her breath, her entire body coiled for a fight. Now that the confrontation was over, a different awareness seeped in, that of closeness, of a shared bond, not simply shaped by adversity, but by genuine care. John broke the silence. "I owe you more than my life," he said, voice husky. "Had you not pursued the inconsistencies, had you not stayed by my side, I might never have uncovered Alden's role. I'd still be a victim of his twisted narrative." His eyes, full of regret and gratitude, slid over her face. "But that kiss, did you really believe I was dying?" The question slammed her with a rush of memories. Her eyes briefly closed, reliving that fateful night. Her voice trembled. "Yes," she admitted, voice a ragged whisper. "I was so sure you wouldn't make it. I couldn't bear leaving you alone without some last kindness." She swallowed, heat rising to her cheeks. "I'm sorry if—" "Don't be," he cut in, voice gentle despite the intensity in his gaze. "Your compassion saved me, in more ways than one. That kiss might have been my final lifeline in a sense, an anchor that kept me fighting." A wry laugh escaped him, colored by emotion. I used to believe sentiments like that were mere theatrics, but not anymore. They fell quiet, a palpable tension simmering in the air, a half-dozen unspoken truths, confessions, and uncertainties hovered between them. The sterile walls of the hospital room, the beep of a distant monitor, and the faint antiseptic odor all receded into an inconsequential backdrop. She recognized in his eyes the same longing she felt welling in her chest, an acknowledgement that, improbable though it seemed, their hearts had intertwined in the crucible of near tragedy. Tentatively, Amber eased closer until she was within arm's reach. "So we go forward from here," she said, her voice trembling with hope and nerves. "You'll reclaim your place at Greytech. I'll keep doing my job, but maybe we don't have to remain strangers. Maybe. Maybe we can see where this takes us, away from sabotage and conspiracies." A faint smile curved John's lips, lighting up his features in a way that made him look younger, freer. "I want that," he confessed, a soft fervor lacing his tone. "I never planned to let anyone close, especially not after everything I've experienced. But you," he trailed off, eyes shining with a depth of emotion that banished all formality. "You're different." She felt her own eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. "And you're no ordinary patient." I never meant to cross a line, but fate had other ideas. Her heart pounded, anticipating the next words, the next step that would define whether this fragile bond could withstand the real world's glare. Leaning forward, she closed the distance between them, pressing a warm, cautious kiss to John's temple. This time, not a final farewell but a promise of beginnings. His arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos outside dissolved. The conspiracies, the corporate battles, and the near loss of life all drifted away, leaving only the hum of possibility. Here in the hush of the hospital's hidden nook, love emerged not as an abrupt collision, but as a quiet unveiling of hearts battered by fear and tempered by hope. When they finally drew apart, the weight of everything left unsaid pressed upon them. Dawn might bring fresh challenges, a public statement that Alden's sabotage had been uncovered, the slow process of rehabilitation for John's health, and the ongoing question of how Amber's professional ethics would mesh with a romance forged in the ICU's crucible. Yet the fear that once choked them both now carried an undercurrent of promise, a conviction that they had survived the worst and found each other in the aftermath. In that single moment, Amber and John shared a silent vow to honor the bond forged when she believed he would die, and to seize the second chance that fate so unexpectedly offered. The future remained uncertain, a labyrinth of complexities, but their hearts, bound by a final kiss that became a stirring new beginning, now beat in tandem, ready to face whatever lay on the horizon, hand in hand.